I'm Lucy Chipkin. I'm conducting an interview with Rose Schonberg. Today's date is the 18th of April 1996 in Sidney, New South Wales, Australia, and the interview is being conducted in English. Your name and spell it?
Schonberg, Schonberg. Rose. My maiden name was Roth, Roth. And I was born in Belgium.
Were you ever known by any other names?
Not that I remember.
Do you have any nicknames?
Not really. My parents called me all Jewish nicknames under the sun, I think. But nothing really definite or that stuck.
Your birth date?
The 29th of April, 1929.
Your age?
I'm 66.
The city?
I was born in Antwerp.
Can you spell that?
My parents?
Can you spell Antwerp?
Antwerp, Antwerp, in Belgium.
Tell me about your family.
Well, we were 4 in the family. I never had more than one older brother. And my father and mother came from Poland, born in Poland. But since it was the part of Poland that was called Galicia, in 1914, I don't know by what coincidence or whether people fled Poland, and they came to Vienna. My father was in the army, actually, in 1914. And I used to joke with my husband because his father was in the army, my father, and I said it's no wonder they lost the First World War. With soldiers like you couldn't win. My mother came with her mother and siblings also to Vienna and actually spent best part of her youth in Vienna. They were made there in 1924. And I understand from what my parents told me, we spoke a lot. My father would tell stories, my mother would talk to us. It was quite a close family. And from what I realize now that I got older, is that I know a lot of the family and I know a lot of the history because my parents were, whenever they had free time with the children, they would talk about the family, they would talk about their youth, they would talk about their hard years and their good years. And so that I do remember stories that maybe other children did not know. They came to Antwerp because Vienna had not been, normalized from after the 1918 war. Housing was difficult, work was rare, so that they decided they were going to make a new life in Antwerp.
When did they go to Antwerp?
They came to Antwerp soon after their marriage in 1924. I don't know exactly when, but it was soon after they married. And my mother, being from a family of 11 children, maybe not all were at home, she felt a bit lost. My father started learning to cut diamonds.
What had he done in Vienna?
In Vienna, he was mostly employed in a library or an employee. He did not have, like in Poland, you go to Cheder at the age of 3. He had a very good Jewish background. He learned German and loved, he said, he enjoyed library work or so because he didn't have to buy the books, he could read them free. And my mother was a very pretty woman, a very handy woman. If she put her mind to do something, she would. She did not go to school to learn to sew, but from her own, with patterns, started sewing and making her own clothes, later my clothes, and so on.
Did she have a sewing machine?
Oh yes. Oh yes, we had a sewing machine. Those things somehow we did have everything. I can't remember having missing on anything. We had, without being wealthy, we had everything and a normal life.
What language did you speak at home?
Excuse me?
What language did you speak at home?
Oh, language. I started out my life with German. And I must say that I spoke perfect German. Now, Belgium was, people felt free, people felt nice, although there was a lot of anti-Semitism, especially in the Flemish part. This came out later during the war too, that the Flemish could get so well along language-wise with the Germans that we were more trouble than if you lived in the French part. Antwerp, most of the people, and most of the Jewish people, and it was mostly Polish people that came to Antwerp, they built up the diamond industry. And let's say, like still today, 80% of the people were in the diamond industry.
What did your father do exactly?
He was, up to 1938, I think, 37 or 38, he was a diamond cutter. That means he worked at home. I remember he used to work. He used to teach people. You used to pay to be taught. There was no technical schools or so. So somebody that knew was paid sometimes to teach somebody the profession. From what I understand, my parents were the first in Belgium from the whole family, my father's family and my mother's family. And little by little, when they established themselves, their brothers, sisters, and so on came. They all came first. They had like a home to come to, which was my parents' home, and then they would get married, or they would branch out, or they would go on their own. I knew a lot of my family, especially my father's brothers, which were different from my mother's family. They worked, for instance, in Belgium. It's a modern country, and although most of the apartments are modern, we lived in an apartment on the 3rd floor in the Jewish quarters, and it was like today the semis. It was long, the bedrooms, you came in through the dining room, lounge, and so on. And we had attics. In Belgium you do have attics, which are like rooms, and you use them as rooms. And two of my father's brothers would sit up there and make up pants, slacks, work pants, and so on. So that whenever I came back from school, the first thing I did was go up and say hello. In the morning, if my mother wasn't ready to take me to school or would dress for it, one of my uncles would walk me to school.
Did your uncles live upstairs?
No, they didn't live upstairs. They came to work. And when they came in and said, hello, anybody ready? You need help? Mother would say, look, she's ready for school, but I'm not. He said, don't worry. I take her to school. So they would walk me to school and things. It wasn't like today. There weren't cars. There weren't, at least no, if you had a car, you were already one of the elite or the wealthy ones. So they walked me to school, and they were mostly there when I came home. And my mother's family came too. I can't remember when they came, but they were different. They were not really workmen, they were more business people, and they were already wealthy before the war. One uncle left in January 1940 for Brazil. And that's when my mother, when we went to say goodbye, and when we left, I remember my mother saying, if Schmiel is leaving, there's going to be a war. He always has the flair to leave just before the big catastrophe or whatever it was, because he left Germany in 1933 to come to Belgium, and that was just before the Nazi occupation. Jewish life in Belgium was rather very orthodox and very nice. My brother went to a Jewish school. He is 4.5 years older than I am. There was a Jewish school. There were two Jewish schools. One which was more like a modern and Hebrew, although it was religious too. And the other one was more orthodox. That's actually where my husband was educated. My brother went to the more modern school. But for girls, there were no Jewish schools. There was like Talmud Torah from the school.
Is that a cheder?
Like a cheder, yes. We used to go there on Wednesday afternoon. There was no public school or in Belgium. We had free, so we used to go for 2 hours to the Talmud Torah. Saturday morning, because people, wherever you lived, you could walk to the school. We used to go there Saturday morning and for prayer, to learn prayer, and Sunday morning to learn modern Hebrew also.
Who taught you?
Some who taught us, teachers that were employed by the Jewish school. The same teachers my brother had at the school were Talmud Torah.
Was your brother bar mitzvah?
Yes.
Tell
yes.
me about that.
When was it? He was born 25, so it was in 1938. I think I remember it clearly because it was one of the big events in his life and in my life. There were a lot in Antwerp, and there still is, but on a modern scale, there were a lot of Stiebler, small congregations. Like, for instance, we here go to a shul. No, if you were close, there were so many Jews around, you didn't go to a big shul. You went like to a stiebel. A rabbi would have like a congregation, and it wasn't with big bimas or what. They made it like whatever they could, but the people didn't care. They went to pray. They didn't go for the decorum and so on. And I remember my brother had his bar mitzvah in one of those stiebel, and to me it was something I do remember, because I think it was the first time in my life that I saw my grandfather sitting there at the prayer, together with my father, together with my uncles from both sides, and to me it was very impressive, and I was the little girl. And I kept on, I loved it. I think I went to shul as long as I could go to between my uncles and the men. Once I had to sit with the women, it wasn't so attractive. We had the party at home. Sometimes you prepared it yourself, sometimes it was a luncheon, sometimes we had a big luncheon. I remember my mother took a cook who cooked the day before, so that we had the luncheon at home. That's about I can see some faces that I knew well, like my grandfather I knew very well. I can see him still on the bar mitzvah. But the rest, I know they were there, but very little stays of it.
Your parents were observant?
Excuse me?
Your parents were observant?
Very observant. We were before the war very observant, and on the other hand, they would not have done any other way because my mother's parents were living in Antwerp. And winter we would go for a little walk and we always ended up the end of Shabbat at my grandparents', most of us. So that we were actually like three cousins who were very close together because we were the three small girls in the family. I was the oldest. I have one Mina a year younger, and Miriam, who lives in America now, 2 years younger. And we were always there. Summer and winter, we ended up at my grandparents' for Havdalah. And after that, we did go home. Whatever the time it was. Summer we would go to the park and play and then go up there, and winter we would just take a walk and end up at my grandparents'.
And for Shabbat, would you be together as a
No,
extended family?
no, that's something that even after the war we didn't have so much. Each family had, each member of the family or each family had their own Shabbat. Later in 1938 or so, when people came from Vienna, all right, this I remember, that when they came and they didn't have where to stay, they stayed with us, or they slept in some place that they had, but then would eat with us or be Shabbat with us. But that was only until they really got their own home, and then everybody made Shabbat in their own home.
What would you eat for Shabbat?
My mother was a very good cook. I know, and I still do it, I think, that for Shabbat it was always traditional. Fish in Belgium was was not a problem. We had the sea, we had all kind of fish. As a matter of fact, a lot of Belgian people used to eat 2-3 times a week fish because it was much cheaper than meat. Now fish is just as expensive almost as meat, but fish has never been a problem. Chicken, meat, Belgium had everything. Fruit, vegetables, they had everything. It was a modern country, and Belgian people eat a lot of potatoes, which is true, but also a lot of vegetables, salads and vegetables, so that was very common.
You said that you were in the Jewish area. Was there a kosher butcher and?
Oh yes, a few. There were a few kosher butchers, there were kosher grocery shops. There, across from us there was a little lady, a grocery shop, where we used to go when we used to get our allowance and go and get a little bar of chocolate, for which Belgium is very well known. There were a lot, and the people used to come and ask you, please, you know me, please come and buy from me. Life was not easy, but it was surely better than in certain other countries. It was modern, and you made the best of it. People had different professions. People would try to do things not to stay in misery, to get with the times. When I started school, my brother had no problem. He started the Jewish school, which was all right. But when I started school, and also my cousin started school, we they went to private schools and learned French. And I went to a public school. Actually, my kindergarten teacher loved me very much. And when I finished kindergarten, she called my mother and asked her, look, put her into that school. I know the school is good and I want her to have the best. But I didn't last longer than 3 weeks there because I said, I don't like the teacher, she's an anti-Semite. And my mother asked me why. And I said, because when Friday, at the time, they were quite tolerant in Belgium. If you were Jewish, you did not have to come to school on Saturday morning. Saturday was only half a day, because you wouldn't write and you wouldn't do things. You didn't have to come to school on Saturday morning. But we had to bring a kind of pinafore every Monday morning. And on Friday she would say, the Jewish children have to take home their dirty apron. She never mentioned dirty when it came to the other kids. And I felt very hurt by it, and after 3 weeks I said to my mother, I'm not going to that school, you better look for another school. I'm not going to last a year with a teacher that I know does not love me, or at least points me out different than the others, because I'm not different. I never felt that I was different. So my mother also wanted me to learn French. French, you could, because Belgium has 2 languages, you know, Flemish and French. French at the time, you could only learn at public school if your parents were of French descent, if you spoke French at home, or something like that, which was not my case. So,
did you speak Flemish?
By then I spoke Flemish. So that the only way to learn French was private school. My mother, I remember, started making up clothes, I don't know, skirts, pants or something like that, to get the money to pay for my tuition, and I was sent to a private school. Most of the private schools in Belgium are Catholic schools. It's not so much to pay, but it was quite an amount if you couldn't afford it, because even today, the government pays for the teachers in secular studies. You only have to pay the teachers that were not secular. Although I came from a very religious home, my parents gave a lot on education. And I sometimes laugh about it, that things have a way to come good in the end. We had to be on time at school, like 8:30, I can't remember. And the first half hour was catechism. I don't know if I pronounce it right, but that was it. Catechism. And the Jewish children did not have to participate. But we had to be there, and we sat in the last row. We could do our homework, we could do something. But look, you're a child and you hear every morning the prayers and everything. I didn't say it at home, but I knew the prayers just as well as any Christian child. During the war, it turned out to be a blessing. Because when I was in hiding, or when I was sent to different schools, there was always something. And I was a quiet child. I was very well brought up. I was a pretty child, if I must say so myself. And to give me an honor, the sisters or what would tell me that I could say the prayer aloud. You know, like somebody that says it aloud and the others repeat it. And all at once it all came back to me. I wasn't in a tight spot. I knew exactly which prayer to say, and I knew exactly, and I had learned it in French. I was 3 years in that school. It gave me one, I think no child can have a better background or solid background of education than I got in that school. This is a fact, that education in Belgium is very good. Public school and private school even better, so that you get a kind of background, a kind of backbone that never leaves you. In private school, like I was, we stayed in once a week to learn to set the table, learn table manners, learn what you serve with what and what you eat with what. It was a very good school.
Were there other Jewish children there?
Yes, but very little. Like, for instance, we were maybe, like they would group classes in the morning for prayers. They would group first, second, and third class in one side. Then they would have fourth, fifth, and sixth in another classroom. And we were maybe 5 or 6 Jewish girls in the back, not more.
Did you socialize with girls from your school?
The non-Jewish ones? No, not really. It wasn't like now that you went from one to the other. I went to school, I would walk home with the girls, but no, I can't remember having been friends with any of the Christian girls really and have missed them.
Did you have any experience of anti-Semitism at this age?
No, not really. I did not. The only experience I had, which I didn't like, was those 3 weeks in the school there. That was all. And I wasn't going to take it. At least I didn't feel that I was different from anybody. Okay, I'm Jewish, but I'm not different. I'm just as clean as the other. I'm just as intelligent. On the contrary. In Belgium, there was a time where they always used to say the first in the class are the Jewish children. They are smarter. And I wasn't about to take it. So I changed school. After my 3rd year in school, when I already had a good background of French and everything else, French was the main thing, my mother put me into public school. By then, I was good enough, because I spoke French, I was good enough to go into 4th grade in the public school, which was naturally a big help. There were more Jewish children.
How old were you at this point?
I started at 7, must have been 9 or something like that. 7, 8, 9, yes. I was 9 years old. And I went to 4th grade then in public school. And I went in 5th grade, the war started. I was in 5th class when the war started. In Belgium, the war started on the 10th of May, 1940.
We'll just hold it there for tape change. At the end, just before the break of the tape change, you said that the war began. Tell me, how did the war begin for you?
I clearly remember that we heard some noises, terrible noises, like a big thunder. And it was a Friday early morning. In May, the days start early. And when I heard that, I just burst into my parents' bedroom. And that was the moment where I heard my mother say to my father, "Joshua, what's that noise?" And my father was in bed, straight, not a muscle moved, and he said, "Sabina, it's war." And this I can remember, like I would be standing there and just see them and hear them say it. My parents were Austrian, and they, on the Anschluss, they were put on their papers that they were German, but they asked them to put down that they were from Austrian origin, that they're not German because they want to be German. I think that, I don't know if my father got up and went to the diamond purse where each diamond dealer or what had like a safe, and I think he went to give back whatever merchandise was not his or work. He went to return to the people and clear whatever there was, money or so, in the safe. And then there were already big posters in the street that said, anybody that is of German or Austrian origin, or I don't know which other country were at war with Belgium at the time, should come to the police and register. My father came home, he had seen that in the street, and he said, "Look, I'm going to the police, but I'll be back soon. Just stay home, don't move. And we will see, we take it one step at a time." And he said, "Look, should they have too many questions or should something happen, I'm taking along Otto, my brother, and he will then come home and tell you what happened or where I am." He went to the police that was from the suburb we lived in, and an hour passed, 2 hours passed, time passed, and they didn't come home. I don't think we made Shabbat that Friday, there was no head. And my mother said, "Look, they didn't come home. I can't understand it." So my mother and I got dressed and we went to the police. She knew exactly where he had gone. And it was just like what they call in French la débâcle. Just nothing was following rules. As soon as we got in, yes, sit down. You know, Belgium, first thing you have to have your carte d'identité, identification card. Nothing happened without that. And even the law says you cannot go in the street or wherever it is without identification card. So we showed it, and they arrested my mother and me too. So she says, "I came to ask why my husband did. And my daughter is born in Belgium. Why?" I didn't have papers, but they could have found it. "Why do you arrest us?" Anybody that would come in even to ask where the street is was arrested. They sent us near Antwerp, in like the outskirts of Antwerp. There was a very big military barracks. And they put us there. They had one side of the barracks for women and the other side of the barracks for men. And they put us there, and we knew then that the men were on the other side and the women here. The law changed and they released us in the middle of the night, I think, or the next day. I know it was dark and you had to camouflage. There was no light in the street, but we knew very well Antwerp. We walked home. And a day later, I think, my brother came. They had let him out because he was only 15. They did not keep children under the age of 16. So there he was released. On Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I think Monday morning or Tuesday morning, somebody came and told us that from the caserne, from the military barracks, there had been a big, military, a parade, not a parade, a march, with the men that were arrested there, and they took them to the central station and put them in trains. My father was seen together with two of my uncles, because they came from Austria, they were Austrian too. So two of my brothers of my mother were also there, and the three found each other, and they stuck together. As soon as my mother heard that they had been put in a train or what, she said, look children, we're not staying here. They're probably being sent away from the Germans, which is the south of France, and I'm going to try to go with whatever means I have. Let's go with a little suitcase to the station, something we can carry. Let's go to the station and try to get a train also to go to France, to the frontier, and then from there to France. A lot of people went to La Panne, because there they thought that was a frontier that was open and close to France, and it was also near the sea. They thought maybe they could get a boat to England, which actually happened to, I don't know, a rabbi that was at Southhead Synagogue originally. He was the only one that ended up in a train that took him to Ostend or wherever, and he ended up on a boat and went to England. He was 17 years old and he was alone. He was the only one. Somehow it was such a unordinary life that people went with the family and lost each other. When we got to the frontier,
by train?
yes, you went to the station and they said, they don't know, there was no schedule, there was nothing. This train goes down south. North you couldn't go, the Germans were already dead, no train was going north, because north is Holland and there's nothing. So we took the train. Wherever we together, we will end up, we will see. When we got to the frontier, they took us by train to a place we never knew or heard of or so on. But they said that's the French frontier, and the French gendarmerie was there looking at the papers of people. When we got there, they asked my brother, being 15, had already an identification card. We could have, at that time you didn't think of it, he could have said he's not 15, he doesn't have, so we would have gone with money. But he showed his identification card. And the fact that he showed it, and it says with him, there was no way it said born in Vienna. So the French arrested him. You see, now you're more sophisticated, because you could have said, look, he's from Belgium, you have no right to arrest him if he doesn't want to come to France. And two steps back, he was in Belgium, on Belgian soil, they couldn't arrest him. But nobody thought about those things. They arrested him because their rule was 15 years, not 16. So they arrested him, and my mother repeated it. I can't remember that. When the gendarmerie took him, he said to my mother, Mommy, they're going to shoot me. I can't remember that, but my mother remembered that till her last day. They put him into also a camp in the north of France where there were Germans and things, and he was a young boy. It didn't last long. He was there only a few days because the German occupation came in, and when they were told that this is a camp where they keep the Germans as enemies, well, they were brothers. So he was liberated from there and went back to Antwerp. He said, look, I'm from Antwerp, can I get back there? I don't know where my parents are, or so on. So the Germans said, don't worry, you go in the train. They took him to the station. He said at that time the Germans were really the brothers that liberated us. He went back to Belgium, to the apartment we had. And my mother and I, we went by train we were in a north of France. There was a city, still is, Abbeville, where we were caught in the train by bombardments. So we left the train, went into bunkers, and after the bombardment we couldn't take the train. They told us we walked at night, not during the day, because the Germans, as soon as they saw refugees, you say about now the war in Lebanese and civil, they saw, the planes were overhead, we could see the pilot's face, and they just were shooting. We walked from Abbeville to Rouen, which is a big city, and there you always end up at the station trying to find.
How long did that take you?
That took us 3 nights. We walked about 105 kilometers, which was about 30 kilometers a night.
Where did you spend the days?
The days we would spend on the fields, in farms, and so on. I remember that you say France. France was very primitive and very dirty. And I was hungry. And a peasant was milking a cow and offered me a drink of milk. And I didn't accept it because the glass or the container she had didn't look clean to me. But then there was a Belgian soldier who had a canteen, and he offered me his canteen to put the milk in. And I did accept it because his canteen was clean. And we went like this. I don't know, after I spoke to you, I started to find out where did we ate from the fields. The peasants were very nice.
Were there other Jewish people with you?
No. No. But at that time you didn't. You were first running for your life. Then you would settle and see, where do I have my people? In Rouen, we were put on a train, and I don't know how long it took. We were sent down south, and at one point the train stopped and they said, this is where you're gonna stay. And whoever was in that same wagon with us went down. They had like a limit of how many people they could put up, and we went down and we stayed. We ended up in an old part of France, a very beautiful part, but very primitive, in the mountains, which is Auvergne. They put us up like in a school, where they put beds and dormitories, and in the class, if it's a big family, they had one room. If it was a small family or women alone, they shared like a big room. And we stayed there. I don't know even if we cooked ourselves. We couldn't have cooked ourselves because there was no way of cooking. There must have been some place that they cooked and we went to eat. And I know that then came the news on the radio that there was going to be a peace, an armistice, at 12 o'clock at night. And the Germans, as far as they would advance, that would be occupied territory, and the rest would be unoccupied. Little did we know that it wasn't much of a difference. So I remember my mother staying up all night and looking at the window, because the school was across from the town hall. And in the morning or early morning, one of the employees of the town hall went and put up a flag. And that's when my mother woke me and she said, Rosie, I know it's a French flag. It doesn't look like a German flag. I know what the German one looks like. She says, but I want you to come and look and tell me, is that the French flag? Are we really in unoccupied territory? And We stayed there for a few weeks without knowing where my father was, without knowing where my brother was. This took a big toll on my mother. She was very brave, and to get some extra for me, or we had no clothes, we had nothing. We lost everything in Abbeville. When we were there and it was bombarded, we just ran without any extra, no suitcase, nothing, just ourselves. As a matter of fact, I realized at that time and that was the beginning of something for my mother, that my mother had lost her hearing from the bombardment. Because when the bombs came, or when the thing, and everybody went down, she just seemed like, no, she in a different world. And I realized, and I said to her, "Mommy, don't you hear?" And she says, "I can't hear anything." Later, after a day or two, it came back. And actually that had been the beginning of a very long sickness or handicap for my mother, who ended up later years with a hearing aid. But that was the first time that I realized that she didn't hear, that from the bombardment or what, it had affected her hearing. And she just seemed like in a different world. And it did scare me. It scared me a hell of a lot of me. But that was it. I went on and I realized that I had to watch my mother and her hearing. When we were in that Arvieux, that little town, there was water on a pump. There was not even toilets in the school where we were, or the place where we were. And the Belgium, there was a little a river. So they went and they got wood and they put up like 2 toilets on the river. And like in the morning, people, you saw them go for a walk to the river because they knew they might have to go to the toilet. And we asked the people around there, "Where do you go to the toilet?" "Oh, we go in the barn." To me, who had learned Middle Age in thing, it looked like, oh, we've been back to Middle Ages. People wore like a uniform, black, with this apron. The man wore the same black smock, a beret. It was like a uniform for the city. My mother used to go sometimes at the farm or meet somebody, ask if we could buy or do something. We didn't have the money, so she offered to do alterations, repairs, and for that she didn't take money, but she got eggs, milk, vegetables, extras, cheese. They made their own cheese. Everything was done in the farm, and everything was a product of the farm. You could buy very little. So this way, we really survived on it.
Where were you living?
We were living in that school. Until a few weeks later, I suppose it was only a few weeks, I can't remember the thing, they said that the Belgians can go back to wherever they come from. They were being repatriated. They could go back to their home wherever it was. And my mother said she wasn't going to move from there as long as she didn't know where my father and my brother were. And anyway, she had been brought up in Vienna, and she did not trust any Germans of Vienna. She said, "They are false. They smile in your face and they put a knife in your back." So she was very much afraid of them. She was not going to go back wherever there was German occupation. Maybe that saved us too, because she was that way. When the people came from Vienna At the time there was no deportation, but there had been already how should I say, abnormal things they did to Jews. She believed every word of it. People would say, oh, come on, we all human and such a cultural people, how can they do those things? People exaggerate. And she didn't think so. She said, I believe it. She even warned me, you will see on the pictures, I had beautiful hair, long curls. She said to me, if we are occupied by the Germans, the first thing I do is cut off your hair, make it very short, because no German's going to pull your hair, your beautiful curls. We have to get to a point where we are immune. We don't give them a chance to hurt us. For instance, long hair is, you can pull them. Short hair, less chance. Little details like this. Actually, she was very logical, and she believed any story that they came and said that happened in Vienna or in Germany, she did believe. And she was for no money going to go back where there was German occupation. When the Belgians went back to Belgium, we went to the next city, which was a bigger city, a kind of a city in France. We rented, actually at the time it was a room, was the attic.
What was it called? What is the city called?
Excuse me?
What is the name of the city?
Rodez. And I went back to school, because by then I think it must have been already, the school year started. There were offices for refugees, because there were also French refugees from all the occupied, and a lot of them didn't want to go back. There were special from the city. It wasn't Jewish. It was all, everybody was in the same boat. My mother didn't speak a word of French. I have been brought up. It turned out to be really a blessing. I did all the translations. Wherever we went, I went with my mother, and I did the translations. And I think we had some privileges more than others, because they taught the people that it was fantastic that the little girl should go with her mother and translate and so on.
You were about 10 at the time?
I was 11. I was exactly 11 when the war started. I had had my birthday just a few weeks before. And then she started to learn. She couldn't sleep. She was worried where her husband was, where her child was. And she would sit up, try to read books, and remember words she heard on the market, and so on. And then in the evening ask me, what does it mean? How do you pronounce it? I remember she would ask me, a plane was an avion, and meat was viande. And she would always confuse the two. With her, the viande was flying and the avion was in the butchery. And then she came once and she said, you have to teach me how to say, now it's my turn. Because when I stand in the queue and people realize I don't know the language, they try to push. So I have to be, I want to know what it is to say, now it's my turn, I'm sorry. And little by little, naturally, she learned French. After we started, we heard that the people had been sent to a camp near the Mediterranean, near Perpignan, and that was Saint-Cyprien. That's where my father ended up. And but that camp stayed for, I think, the whole war. I had one uncle. He's the youngest uncle, the youngest brother of my mother, who I must say is a very clever man. He was the first one, after 3 months, he was the first one to be out of that camp. Once he was out and he was in Perpignan, he got papers for my other uncle and my father to get them out. So after 3 months they were out. He went then to Spain, Portugal, Cuba and America. He offered to take my father along, my second uncle to take my father along. But my father said the same thing my mother said, as long as I don't know where my family is, I'm not budging from here. First I have to find them. He went to a town in south of France called Toulouse. There was quite a big Jewish population by then there. And he even found there back a brother of his, the older brother, with his wife and things, so that he had a place where to be. We found him back after 6 months. And when we found Daddy, my father, he told us that my brother was in Antwerp in the flat. And
how did you find your father?
We wrote to different organizations. And what it was, it's even after the war, is that it was like a welfare. And whoever was looking for somebody came to the welfare. Every day they came there, they might have eaten there or something, and they looked around because people were trying to get closer to their own. They looked around, and one day there was a letter where somebody said, "Aren't you so-and-so?" He said, "Yes." He said, "It's funny, there's a letter from a woman looking for you." And that was my mother. We wrote around, and from the prefecture, they also tried to find in the registers if anybody registered under that name. And somehow we found, after 6 months, one day my father, we knew he was there. We had a letter from him, and one evening he showed up. Because even in France before, they tried to round up and put the people in certain places or what, they hadn't the possibility to accommodate so many refugees. And he told us where my brother was. So we got in touch with my brother, and I think a year later, my brother came. And so we were the 4 of us together.
In Rodez?
In Rodez. I started like most normal life possible. I went to school. I had my school certificate because I finished like primary, and at that time a lot of people didn't go any further. But I registered in high school, so I could go. I didn't have to go until 14 at primary school. I could go to high school. And I don't know really what business or how we survived on there. But I know that after about a year, my brother came. We were in Rodez in August 1942, when there was the first big razzia in most of unoccupied France. By then we knew that the Vichy government was not what we thought it would be, but we didn't expect that. How did we know about it? There was a Jewish girl from Paris who was a scoutmaster. And she went to a meeting that evening, and one guy that saw her come in said, "What are you doing here? Aren't you Jewish?" And she said, "Yes, so what? There's no meeting." He said, "Yes," he said, "but my father has a bus company, and all his buses have been requisitioned for tonight." And he asked one of them, "Why?" And they said, "We're going to round up the Jews. So we need the buses to bring them to I don't know where."
We'll just hold it for there for a minute. We were cut off at the point where you were telling me about the girl who had heard about the buses being requisitioned.
Yes, so she didn't stay for the meeting, naturally. She went home and told her parents. And she had a sister, and her parents said, look, there are a few, we know all the Jewish families around here. You go to these three, your sister goes to those three, your father goes to another part, and I get ready and we all leave, we try to leave the house. They came to us and told us that, and I know we had some friends, French people that we made friends of. So my mother and I went to one friend and we said, look, can you put us up for tonight? We don't know what's going to happen, but at least tonight. And my father and my brother went to a Spanish couple that had been our neighbors and moved away. And they were living like a bit on the outskirts of the city. They went there at night, and she realized she had been through the Spanish War and everything. She was sympathetic to the cause, and she put them up. In Paris and in occupied France, there were already a bit of arrests. You know, people were arrested, there was the big thing in July in the Vélodrome d'Hiver in Paris. So people already were trying to figure out, is it going to come to there? And there were French Jews, quite prominent, who had also ended up in the same city and with whom we became friends, who took then everything in hand and started to find places, pay for identification cards, look for places to hide. They went to priests, they went to convents, they went to high schools, they went to people that they knew were resistant already. I don't know how, but I guess one knows from the other. And there was a French couple there, which she wasn't Jewish, but a very nice woman, and he, Lipschitz, and they were the ones that were really our correspondent in that cause. I don't know how we let them know where we were. And they came, I know she came the next day in the morning, and she said, look, nothing happened in our place. But I think we told them when we went to tell them also, get out of the house. You know, one went to the other, and they knew where we had gone. And she said, but they came to your place. It turned out later that they went to the places of people that had come to France after 1938, after the Anschluss and so on. Those were the first that were rounded up. So we knew we couldn't move anymore, we couldn't go out, we couldn't do anything. They tried to get some clothes for us or what, but the door was broken in and then sealed. I can't remember if they got anything for us out or what. This I can't remember. In any case, I think we stayed a few days with those friends. Then at night, we walked down to where my father and brother were, and we stayed there. And after a few days, the husband didn't like it, he was afraid or so on, so she said, look, can you find another place? And we went to somebody, a young woman, a teacher, who had a ground floor apartment, and she had like a room she didn't use, very primitive, like a storage room. And there she put mattresses on the floor, and there we stayed. But you know how it was. She was a teacher when teaching during the day. So you couldn't sneeze, you couldn't talk, you couldn't do anything because everybody knew she isn't home, so where does the noise come from? Even when you wanted to go to the toilet, you went under the window so nobody should see a face or a shadow in the house. There, actually, I went out from there. That Mr. Lipschitz came to pick me up one morning. I only stayed 3 weeks, like 3 weeks in hiding, like that. He came to pick me up one morning and took me by bus to Villefranche-de-Rouergue. There he had been in contact with a man, a young man with a young family, and he had said, look, no problem, I help you. I was one of the first cases. She can go into high school and boarding school. And when we came there to his office, he was director of a silo, you know, silos where you put corn and grain and thing, and in agriculture. When we came there, he took us to the high school, and we met the headmaster of the high school. And when the headmaster heard that I had already been 3 weeks in hiding, and that we were already sought by the Germans, he said, I can't take her, because I didn't have any papers, and it didn't occur to anybody to put me under a false name. We were really the first victims in France. So that man that took us there said, it's no problem, she can stay with me. And Lipschitz said goodbye to me, and I went home with him for lunch.
What is his name?
His name was Marcel Cazalet, and I stayed with him for on and off 2 years until the liberation. He went through a lot too. He was probably they found out that he was in the resistance. He was caught. He wasn't caught. His wife was caught and put in prison. But then when the Gestapo came to the house, we were on holiday in the country. They arrested everybody, even the maid, and they left me with the young children. For me, it had been a problem. I spoke still perfect German. And they had a translator. And whenever the German spoke in German, I understood. I had time to think about the answer, but I had to watch not to give the answer before the translator asked the question, because otherwise I would give myself away that I knew German. Well, everybody was arrested. I was left in the house, I think. But that came, so as I was saying, Cazalet took me home, and I stayed with them like their own child. At the time, it wasn't an unusual situation. You would see now a child at somebody's house, you would say, where does the child come from? Who is it? At the time, it wasn't an unusual situation, because lots of people of occupied territories would send their children to family in the country, because there was food, there were no bombardments, it was safer, it was quieter, and there was also nutrition.
Did they say that you were one of the family?
So they said, it's a niece. They said, and they told me, they said, if anybody asks you, you say you're a niece, and that's it. I didn't need identification. When a few days later or so on, August must have been September, school started. I went to school. I started high school there. And I had how would I say? I had like what was a normal life of a child at the time for a year.
Were you in fear?
Excuse me?
Were you in fear that year? Were you frightened?
No, not really, because all at once there was a young child in the house which I loved, and I would keep busy and I would help a bit. I knew I wasn't the daughter of the house and I couldn't be, so I was helpful in the house. And no, I didn't. The first few nights I didn't sleep. I just couldn't apprehend being people I had never seen before, people that were not really the same culture, people that were like strangers and different culture, different religion, everything different. And I had to get used to going out. I hadn't been out for 3-4 weeks in the air. After a while, when I got to know them, I didn't fear. I took like my normal life, and he would be in correspondence with that Lipschitz. I knew that my brother had gone to a farm to work, and he was out of hiding. I knew that my mother, they had found a place for her as a farm maid, someplace also in the around there someplace, although it might have been only 50 or 100 kilometers, but at the time it was a lot. There was no buses, there was no cars to go, there was no corresponding transport, so everything seemed far away. And my father was the last one to be taken out of hiding, and he went to work in a factory where they made bricks. It wasn't unusual at the time that the man came there on his own. They had like a brick factory, or in France was like out of the town, and since you didn't have cars or transport, the man would come there on Monday morning or Sunday night and stay the whole week. They had like a room, or they shared a room, and they ate in the canteen. And for the weekend they would go home if they didn't live too far, or they would even only go home once a month because they lived too far away. So that it wasn't unusual to have a man there on his own, even if he had a family. And that's where my father was. Actually, he stayed there the whole war. He made friends. I think that the friends knew that he was Jewish, but they never spoke about it. My brother ended up there too, because the peasant way was they got scared or so on. He ended up there, and then when he ended up there, they realized that they couldn't pass for father and son because somebody made a mistake of a syllable on the identification cards, and it wasn't the same name, so they couldn't find. Looking at them, you couldn't think it was father and son. They're quite different. But my father was happy he could keep an eye on a young man at the time. Then came the time where, there was no military service because France was at war. But what the Germans did, they they took the young people and they sent them to Germany to work in factories instead of military service. So that was also a danger for my brother. So when this happened and he turned, 18 or so, and was in danger of being sent to Germany, he went to work for another peasant. because as long as you worked the earth and you gave them the quantity they requested of food, they left you to work the earth. So he was there, but he was arrested. Everybody did their own thing. Once a German car came along the road, and there were 3 young men working the field, and they arrested them without asking any questions. I was with Cazalet the whole year, very happy, very well taken care of. Nothing really to. I was the child of the house. I was their child, and there was really, I can't say anything that was different or because I wasn't their own. We went to the country during the holidays, and there were other friends that came, and that's where the Germans came to arrest Cazalet. He wasn't home. He had gone to the city or someplace with his brother-in-law and a friend. They arrested the women. When they came back during the night, Cazalet said, "What happened?" And I told him. So he took his car and left. And the brother-in-law, that's what saved me, that the brother-in-law and the friend's husband, friend, stayed there. And what do you know, in the morning, the Gestapo was back with the maid. They brought back the maid. And they ordered her to cook and do everything while they interrogated thing. And I heard one of the Germans that said, "Where's the girl? Where's the girl? She's the one that told Cazalet the story." So the brother-in-law said, "Sorry." She didn't say a word. She's so shocked she didn't say a word. But he said, "We know exactly what happened, because first of all the 2 women were missing. The maid was missing. And it's not our habit to leave a child with the children alone in the house overnight. So when we came in and we didn't find the women, and we saw she was alone with the children, we could figure out on our own what has happened." And that's what saved me. I got dressed and I didn't go out of the house, of my room, really. I slept with the children. Naturally, it was more comforting to put all the children in one room and me in the bed, and that's how I spent the night. The 2 men there were beaten. I opened the door, I saw one sitting there in the hallway, bleeding. He said to me, don't worry, I'm all right, get back in. Don't move as long as you're not being asked to move." By morning, they took the 2 men. And I stayed with the maid and the children. So I didn't know what to do. So I called first of all the grandparents. I called first of all another brother of Mrs. Cazalet, who lived in the town, in Villefranche-de-Rouergue, because I forgot to tell you that from Rodez we went to Cazalet, who lived in Villefranche-de-Rouergue, which is another very beautiful old town in France. And we called the family. They called the grandparents of the other children. And the maid said, "Look, I'm out of here. I don't care about anything else. I have had my night. I'm out of here." The next day, so the brother came and stayed with me until the grandparents came, picked up the other children, and then we went. I went down to Villefranche, back to Villefranche-de-Rouergue, and stayed with the brother of Mrs. Cazalet until things... I took care of the child. I took care of Jean-Luc. I knew what he was used to. He knew me, and so on.
What happened to the men who had been arrested?
Well, that a few days after, the men arrested were, you know, like it was. They were traitors, but they were also like double agent. They worked with the Germans and they worked with the resistance. And those people, Cazalet got in touch with them. He knew who they were. He got in touch with them and said, look, my wife has been arrested, my friend's wife, and my brother-in-law, and my friend. And look, something has to be done. Mrs. Cazalet was pregnant at the time. So those double agents, after 3 weeks, they came out. The women came out, and the men a few days later were liberated. They were not the cases they were looking after or for, so they came out. When Mrs. Cazalet came back, meanwhile, during those 3 weeks, I stayed with the brother of Mrs. Cazalet and took care of the child. One evening or one day, it wasn't telephone and so on, although they did have telephone. They were very modern and very up to date. One friend of the Cazalet who was retired, he had been a high school headmaster and she had been a teacher and they were living there, came and said, you know, Rosie, for a change, come and have dinner with us tomorrow night. I come and pick you up, or you come be during the day and I bring you home, don't worry, come and have dinner with us. And everybody said, well, that would be a nice change. And on the way to their house, or before I went in, the man said to me, I have a surprise for you. Keep it quiet. Don't tell even the brother. I knew the secrets that even the brothers didn't know. And I looked at him and he said, Cazalet is hidden at our house. And he wants to see you. And that's why we invited you to dinner. He said, so that you can talk. There are certain things he has never cleared up. He has never gotten to know. So you will see. Don't be shocked. Naturally, to me, I was very happy. I was happy I saw him. I was happy. And I was flattered in a way. Maybe I didn't realize it, but I knew that there was a situation when they told you, don't tell, you couldn't tell it for any money. So that night I was there. I think we spoke about what had happened, how it happened, and what was going, if I knew about it, and so on. And all right, I came back. I didn't say anything, but the only thing he asked me the favor, he said, don't worry, Rosie, you'll be taken care of. You don't worry. For the moment, the situation is so, but we will take it one day at a time, and don't worry. And the only favor I remember he asked me was, in the afternoon, I used to go for a walk with a little boy. He said, do me a favor, tomorrow when you go for a walk at 2:30 or at 3 o'clock, whatever time it was that he woke up and that I took him for a walk in the street under the window here so that I can see him. And we used to have already our regular date or so when I would go for a walk and he could see his child. Well, as I said, 3 weeks later, Germaine was set free. She came back and I asked her, I said, what's going to happen now? Look, you have your worries. What's going to happen with me? So she says, don't worry, I put you into boarding school. When I'm going to my mother and have the baby there. Once I have the baby, I come back here and I probably try to live as normally as possible, and then you can come back and stay with me again. To me, that was acceptable. So a few days later, she came and she said to me, look, there has been not a change, it's up to you. A friend of those teachers where Cazalet had been hiding, a friend of theirs was an ex-minister, Paul Ramadiee, and he lived in the Casville. He must have also known, because he knew that they had a child which was a Jewish child. So when he came to visit his friends, he asked questions. He said, look, I understand you might not want to tell me where Cazalet is or what the woman is going. What's going to happen to the child? And she said, well, I don't know. So he said, well, look, I know that they have their own worries. If the child is a problem, she can have a home in my home. And one morning, Mrs. Cazalet said, look, this is what happened. And I was not willing to change, because that was the second family I knew, and I loved them, and I trusted them. And I rather would have gone to the high school and be sure to get back to them than go to another family. The Ramadiees were older than they were. Their sons were already grown up. One was in Indochina, and one was an engineer, married and lived in the south of France. So it was altogether different. I said to her, what do you advise me? I do what you tell me to do. I can't make a decision on my own. So she said to me, look, I think you'd be happier with a family, and they must be nice people, otherwise they wouldn't offer a thing like this. I think you'll be happier with them, but I promise you one thing. When I come back and I do have a home and I get established, I take you back with me. So I accepted, and a few days later I went to, Mr. Ramadiee came to pick me up. And I went to the Casville and I stayed with Ramadiee. It was a beautiful house. It was a different life, but I did not feel as close to them. Madame Ramadiee herself felt, I think now I figured it out, she was kind of, she missed being in the limelight. She missed her two sons that she adored and adored her. She had to cope with life in a small town, although he had been the mayor of the Casville. But that was really like an honorary title, because he was most of the time in Paris. He was a lovely guy. He also felt frustrated, but he was a very intelligent guy. And what he did is that we would start school at, let's say, 9 o'clock. And from 7:45 to 8:45 in his study, he would give lessons of Greek and Latin to high school children who decided much later that they wanted to become doctors or so on. And they had to have Latin, and they hadn't taken Latin in high school. So he gave them every morning lessons, and I was ready for school. I would walk with them to school. He occupied himself with a lot of, he had a library which was unique. He was a solicitor from profession. He grew in the backyard his own tobacco for his pipe. And I stayed there and I went to school, high school there. Oh, I've been to a lot of high schools, I can't even remember. And one thing I couldn't remember when I spoke to you the other day is that actually one night I had like my own little office.
We'll just hold it there for a minute. 19th of April 1996. I had to interrupt you there, but you were telling me about you had your own little office.
Yes, I had. It was a beautiful house. It still would be a beautiful house in our days. The furniture came from his family that had been in the family for years and years. I had like my little office that was his waiting room to come into his office, but he wasn't really practicing, so I stayed there. And one night, I can't remember the date. This is something that I can't remember. One night, I felt that there was something abnormal, a commotion. People that came to the house I had never seen before. And I kept on sitting there, although I had finished my homework. I felt like something's gonna happen, I don't know what. I was waiting for somebody to tell me, but it didn't come. So I said to myself, well, I got up and I went through his office where he was. And I said, I finished my homework, I put everything away, I think I can go to bed now. I'm gonna go to bed now. And he looked at me and he said, Rosie, wait. We might not be able to stay here tonight. I'm waiting for a communication, I'm waiting for somebody, a message. Please wait. So I saw that my fears or my premonition was right. Not long after, a few minutes later, somebody came and he said, look, Rosie, put on your coat, take your pajama, and you go with this lady and you will stay overnight there. Mrs. Ramadiee and I are going to some other friends. The whole story started again. And I said to him, why? And he said, well, I'll tell you. We have been told that the people, in 1940, all the ministers were called to Vichy and asked to vote whether they were going to collaborate with the new government or they were against the new government. He said, usually a vote is discreet, but there they didn't. As soon as you voted it, they knew exactly who had voted yes and who had voted no. He said, I was one of those that voted no, and I just heard that now they're gonna put us into, round us up or put us into some camp or whatever it is, because we were against the Vichy, we voted against the Vichy government. Okay, that was an explanation that I could accept, and we went away. Nobody came, nothing happened that night, but the fear was there. And he decided, Ramadiee, that he was not gonna stay in the Casville permanently. He had a big farm where we used to go once in a while on a Sunday. And he had other properties, so that he would move around from one property to the other as not to give anybody a chance to know where he was, or to know he's always there, we can get him whenever we want him. That was his way, not that it did help if you think about it, but that was his way of thinking. I think at that time they put me into boarding school in the high school. I wasn't there long because it was almost holidays. June is holiday time. By then I knew that my auntie had had her baby, who was a baby girl, and that they had gone together under false papers to live in some isle of a castle or some farm out in another department and thing. And she told me, for the holidays, you can come and stay with us. So when I left school, I went back to Ramadiee, who was there. He knew about it. He said, if you want to go, you're free to go. But then he said to me, don't forget that the trains, there's always people coming in and asking for identification. You're 15 years old, maybe you should have an identification. Actually, he was a very clever man and he was very, how should I say, he was very naive about all that. So I said, all right, and I went to the police department the next day and I said, look, I turned 15 and I need an identification thing. And I gave my real name because I didn't have any other papers or what. And I thought, well, we're far from where I used to live. There's no, but they had everything, it was sent around. The people they couldn't round up, they had sent the identification to wherever they thought we could be. So that the police said, oh, but we have your file here and you are Jewish. And I didn't answer really. I don't think I ever answered the question. So they gave me, I had pictures made, actually it's still the thing. They gave me like a laissez-passer because the first 3 months before you get your identification card, they give you a paper just for the time. And then he said, yes, but I have to put a stamp on it. It took him half an hour to find where he had the stamp. And he put the stamp over the paper, Juif. I took it, I went home, and I didn't say a word. When Ramadiee asked me, did you go to the police? Yes. Did you get a paper? I said, yes, I got my laissez-passer. Good. And he didn't ask me to see it or whatever it was. I knew that if I went with a paper like this, it was no good. What was going to happen, I don't know, but it was no good. I could not think. So I thought to myself, maybe I just throw it away and I lie about my age, or I have it with me, and if I see Germans or what, I won't show it. I couldn't sleep that night. And a few times I got up and looked at it. Whenever I couldn't, I just looked at it. And the policeman himself had said, when he put it on, he said, well, it's not very visible. But if you looked, you could see that there was something. So that kept on, I had it in mind, it's not very visible, but I don't want to see it at all. So in the middle of the night, I woke up, I looked at it again, and I thought, well, I wasn't going to use it, so I might as well make a mess out of it. And I took a hanky, or something I had on my hand, and I went very slowly over it, and it disappeared. So I even turned on the night lamp, and I held it against the lamp to see if there was any traces of it. But if you looked at it that way, you couldn't see that there had been a stamp, at least. I didn't tell anybody about it. And as scheduled, 2 days later, I left the Casville, and I went to near Castres, or wherever it was, and joined Cazalet and his wife and the 2 children. And that was, it must have been the holidays. And I can't remember what we did for. I know Cazalet used to cook to not to be bored. He did the cooking. We used to walk. We used to go to farms to get food. Must have occupied himself, but he still, I presume now that he was still in contact more than ever with the resistance. And we knew about D-Day, we knew about that they were taking more and more, liberating more and more space or land in France.
Did you have a radio? Did you have a radio?
Oh yes, radios we had. And we listened even clandestine to London and things like that. So then we were told not to go out too much, because at the last days before liberation, you had either you found a German who didn't want to do any harm because he was human and didn't want to have it on his conscience or be caught, and the people should say, oh, he killed everybody on the last day. Or you could find somebody. You had 2 kinds. One that was kind and thought, look, I don't want to do any harm on the last day before, because it's our end. And others that thought, well, it's our end, I might as well do whatever I can. So we stayed in for I don't know how long, and then one day somebody came and said, okay, go home. We're free. That was the part. We never saw any army, we never saw any Americans or what. We were in the bush, like you would say here, and but we were told, we liberated, and you can go back wherever you came from. So I can't even remember how we went back. I know that I was back in Villefranche, in the home where we were, with them. And during the time I saw my brother a few times. He came as a young man, he traveled, came to see me. I saw my father once in those 2 years. I saw my mother, I went to see her once in those 2 years. When we were back it must have been September 1944 that we came back to Villefranche-de-Rouergue. One day Cazalet came home and said to me, I had a visitor in the office today. And who was it? He said, it was your father. I was used to the home. I knew I had parents, but that was my life there. I couldn't think about anything else. I think all at once I realized, yeah, it's true. I'm not theirs. I have a father, I have a mother. And he said to me, your father came to claim you. But my father was a very kind man and a very soft man. He didn't come home and say, you are my daughter, come with me. He went to his office and said, look, I'm her father. We liberated. We have to start all over. I don't have much, but we will do it together. So now, can I have my daughter back? And naturally it was thing. And he said to me, he said, look, Rosie, he's your father. Your mother survived. I think your brother is also survived. You're all going back to Rodez, where you're going to live together. If it wasn't your father that came to claim you, I never give you back. And that's how we started all over again. I went with my parents to Rodez. I think I went back to school there, because it must have been October or something like that. And my mother was very sick after her ordeal. My father was never a big man. He was even smaller than thing. My brother was a young man at the time. He had been arrested, he had jumped from a train. But it wasn't a deportation train, it was a train where the French were sent to assembly. And when he jumped without paper, he went into the resistance, because that was the only place he could be. He couldn't go back wherever he was. So we were the four of us together. We tried to lead as normal a life as possible, still in France. And then the rest of the country was liberated. Belgium was liberated, and in May there was the end of the war. So that time the prefecture told us that the Belgians, people that had lived in Belgium before the war and were like permanent resident, could register to go back. So we did that. And it was the end of April. We were sent to Paris and put in a hotel or someplace for a few days. Then we went to the Gare du Nord, and there we met one other family that we recognized from Antwerp, also with 2 children, older than we were. And we naturally, we went together, and we sat together, and we compared notes how we got saved. And they took us to the border. And there we had to go through papers and showing up papers and waiting for the next train, which was a Belgian train. As a matter of fact, the lady, Mrs. Markovich, said to my mother while we were sitting there and waiting, she said, I wonder if we're already in Belgium or if we're still in France. And at the same, it was late at night after they had fed us, and there were a cleaning woman coming in. And my mother says, look, we soon know where we are. And he says, how is that? She says, look, if they're gonna wash with water the floor, we in Belgium. If they just gonna put sawdust on it and go over with the broom, then we're still in France. That was like the difference between Belgium and France. Belgium has always been very advanced, very clean, very thing. I know years after the war I met a woman from Poland that came to establish herself. And she said to me that she remembers that when she learned geography at school, they mentioned in the geography book that in Belgium, on Friday or Saturday, they cleaned the street, they washed the streets. The person that lived downstairs not only washed her hallway, but she always washed the street. And that was true. I don't know if they still do it, but that was so. If you lived on the ground floor, you knew that you had to wash the street in front of your house. And we came back to Antwerp the 1st of May, 1945. Antwerp was very bombarded. We didn't find back anything that we had left.
Was your apartment not there?
No. First of all, you didn't have your own things, but it was known that the day they came to pick you up, like to arrest you, and they had your address, there was a big moving firm, Arthur Pierre, in Antwerp, who the next day came with a van and took out everything from the house, emptied the apartment. Actually, the Jewish quarters were all occupied by people, by Christian people, who had been living before near the harbor. You know that Antwerp is a big harbor. And it was bombarded, very bombarded. So the people that lived there moved into the flats that had been empty. And, well, we actually, the family that before the war never lived in Belgium, couldn't imagine that it had been that bad in Belgium. It's not television and communication, so they didn't listen. They didn't give news in the radio from Belgium or so when you were in Poland or Hungary or wherever it was. So that they were hoping that from Belgium there would be less damage and more people left. So they came to Belgium. That's how we found ourselves all back, almost all of us back in Antwerp, except for 3 uncles that were living in America. And I will say that for a family for after the war, we were one of the big families. Okay, one aunt, her son had been killed in the ghetto. Another uncle saved himself with a son in Russia. His wife and another son were deported. And there were fragments of families, but they came back. And my father was very hurt. He was the only survivor of his family. It did affect him very much. He had given up everything what was in belief. He just did what was necessary to survive. But my mother, having her family who were religious and started again, and having children, she believed that life had to go on as we had started. And we went back to, my father went along with it, went back to synagogue, went back to Jewish life, and so on.
Rosie, while you had been living with the other families, how did you manage things like the kosher change?
That, look, the kosher change we had already managed before, because when we came to France as refugees, there's no question of kosher. There was no question of kosher. Okay, my mother couldn't look at pork. That's not. In the beginning, we ate fish, and that was very seldom. Okay, they had trouts there because they had rivers. But we saw that it was impossible. We didn't know how long it was going to last. If you go away for 8 days, I won't eat meat for 8 days. That's not the end of the world. But if you don't know, you ate whatever you could get. Okay, she put a line, no pork. We never, I think that in our house, although it wasn't kosher during the war, I don't think she ever put butter whenever there was meat or anything like that. There was still a division, but nothing strict. You couldn't do it. It's impossible. when we came back to Belgium, we started all over. I can't remember if there was already meat, kosher or what. I don't know. I can't really remember. But I know very, very soon everything came back to normal in Belgium. I can't even remember if there were still tickets, like coupons for food when we came back to Belgium. I think even that was already over.
When you were living with the Cazalets, what was your own, how did you feel about your Jewishness at that?
Well, they knew I was Jewish. They were very Catholic, especially Mrs. Cazalet. But they never forced it upon me. They never asked me to go to church with them, or they never said anything like that.
Did you go to church with them?
No, not with them. When I was in school, in high school, and Sunday I didn't go out, they took us to church Sunday morning. And I asked Ramadiee, I said, they take us to church Sunday morning. And he said to me, my advice to you is go. Don't make yourself be the exception. When I said to the one that took care of us, there was always one girl only on Sunday that took care of the boarders. I said to her, oh, to church. I'm not really used to go to church. My family is not really churchgoers. So she said, oh, but that will complicate our life, because you cannot stay alone in the school without having somebody watch you. So if you don't go to church, the surveillante, the one that is there were 2 during the week, she won't be able to go home or go out until we get back to church, from church. So I felt that I was already, you didn't want to do anything to upset anybody. So I asked him, I said, what do I do about church? He said, look, my advice to you is go. Don't make it visible, or don't point out that you are different. So you go. And so that was the time, I think, that I did go on Sunday morning. If I didn't go out, I did go on Sunday morning to church.
Did you have any consciousness of Jewish?
Yes, I did. Actually, even in Villefranche, there were always French Jews. And I don't know if you know the way it went. It went that first they arrested the people that came after 1938. Then they arrested the people that were foreigners. And only very late in the war did they arrest the people that were French. The same thing was in Belgium. The Belgians were arrested only in 1943 or so on. So that I did have contact with other Jews, and they would tell me, they would say, next week, Monday, Tuesday, will be Rosh Hashanah. And the week after, there's Yom Kippur on that day and day. And I remember that I knew 12 years I have to fast. And I told that, I think. And they just couldn't get over it, that you would stay from sunset to the next sunset without even taking a drop of water. This I remember, she said, can't you have even a little bit of sugar to suck on? I said, no, and I don't feel uncomfortable. But I think that was once when we were in Villefranche. Later, it was like lost. I didn't get in contact with anybody. Yes, I very early had a Jewish education and Jewish background, so that I knew who I was. I knew what it was, maybe not as well as grown up, but I knew certain things. I knew Yom Kippur you fast and you do it after the age of 12. I knew Rosh Hashanah. I knew about other holidays, but I kept it.
We'll just hold it there for a minute. Eighteen.
18th of April.
What did I say? 19th.
Yeah, you said that before, I think, too. And you can find.
Rose, tell me about what happened to Paul Ramadiee at the end of the war.
Well, at the end of the war, Paul Ramadiee was, I think, back in politics. He actually, the street where he built his house, because he built it in the beginning of the war, or maybe before, but it was like a lane or a street that had no name. And after the war, they named it, because in his honor, they named it Avenue de la 4e République. It was the 4th Republic. Because before the war it had been the 3rd Republic, and after the war it was the 4th Republic. He went back to Paris. He became a minister, and even at one point he was prime minister. At that time in France, they changed every 3 weeks, 3 months, the prime minister, and he was, I think, prime minister for 6 months. He's not very well remembered in France because he instituted what we have here, like the green slip, the vignette on the cars. That was his idea when he was treasurer. And that stayed on for years and years, but they didn't like him because that was his idea of income. I don't know when he passed away, because by that time I was already in Belgium. I got used to different, as I said, she was not very, I couldn't get close to her. And she got back in the life of being the prime minister's wife, or being a minister's wife, and so on. And her son, Indonesia, naturally, you know what happened, so he came back to live in France. He was actually too occupied and too big. I just kept in touch with them for New Year's. I never missed sending him a card until I heard that he passed away. That was the end.
What about the other family, the Cazalets?
Oh, the Cazalets? Well, they went to live in Castres. No, Castres? No, Carcassonne, where he was also in agriculture. And I visited them quite a few times. They had 7 children. And Mr. Cazalet passed away in late 70s. And she's still alive, and I still correspond with her. Actually, I thought she probably likes to see the Catholic sides of Israel. And when my daughter got married, and she got married in Israel, I did write to her and offer her to come to Israel at my expense, stay there, be at my daughter's wedding, and see the sights. But she said no, she does not feel like traveling for her is getting a bit difficult. She can't see herself traveling, and it wasn't the moment either. So I said, look, anytime I go, I'll let you know. You want to meet me? You're very welcome. My office stays. That's about all the children now. Mostly married, some are quite different professions and so on. I don't know, now that I'm older, maybe I think that maybe we should have acted differently or what. But when we got back to Belgium, especially my parents, you got so busy with rebuilding your life. You got so busy with trying to make a living and so on, that I kept in touch with them, but maybe they should have done more or so, but I don't know. This comes only, with later years you start thinking about it.
In the pre-interview, you told me that you were exactly the same age as Anna Frank.
Yes.
And this had had a profound effect on you.
Actually, when I read the book of Anna Frank, it was like those 3 weeks we were in hiding or so, were exactly what she described, except that they stayed longer. It didn't affect me so much because it was like reading my own story. The only thing is that her diary she kept one. It was found out later and it was made so public. But there were hundreds of children in those cases. There were also children that were different. I seem to have, at that point, I seem to have realized what was happening, that it was a dangerous time and that you had to go with the tide. You couldn't be stubborn, I want this and I want that, because there were other children that Cazalet was hiding. I think there were 28 children that he placed, either in high schools or in convents or in other places. I know 2 Jewish girls that were in the high school where I went, and they came Sunday, they came for dinner at the house. There were 2 boys, actually 2 boys from Antwerp, that were in the high school and that came. One of the girls I know was always crying she wants her mother, she wants to go back to her mother. And when it came holiday time, there was no way that she was going to go any other place, and she went to her mother. You say about holidays. One year, I was at Cazalet, it was Pesach, and there was still the Osée in France. Did you hear about it? Œuvre sociale de l'enfance. And they were sponsoring and paying for Jewish children in different things. So when it came Pesach, they made like a camp. Also for the girls that were in different places. Although I had Cazalet and I could have stayed there, to me it was like a challenge to go to a camp with other Jewish girls. And I went there. I don't know where it was, also in the country, but at another place. And as a matter of fact, we were 2 or 3 only that wouldn't eat chametz. And we didn't get the matzahs until the last day of Pesach. Things were not normal. Nothing was normal. And years later, I once went to synagogue, to a bar mitzvah in Antwerp. And a young lady, a woman my age, came over to me and looked at me and she said, "You haven't changed." I know she lived in Antwerp, I had seen her, but somehow in the beginning I couldn't place her. And then I forgot. And I said, "What do you mean you haven't changed?" She said, "You know what? I remembered, I knew your face, And I remember now we were together in that camp on Pesach. But I don't know if she was somebody that had lived or got married only and came to live to Antwerp or so. But very few people I found back from that period. It was a certain period. I considered myself always very, very lucky.
How do you think your experience during the war affected your own religious belief?
It affects my belief in humanity. I wouldn't say religious belief. It affects my attitude to other religions, to other people. When I learned later on the difference between the Catholic Church and so on, which I heard about only later, didn't as a child, I did ask Cazalet once on a visit. I said to him, look, I'll be very frank, I don't know how you think, but they say that you say that the Jews crucified Jesus and that's why we should be I don't know, persecuted or something like that. You are such a Catholic. How could you, with that belief, save so many Jewish children? So his answer to me was, and that was a lesson to me, his answer to me was, look, Rosie, it depends on your character and it depends on your way you interpret the Bible, the religion. He said, we all came from the ancient time and the 10 Commandments. In the 10 Commandments, this says, don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you. He said, I went by this. I went by the fact that why should a child or somebody be persecuted because he was born Jewish? You had no doing in it. Would I want my child to be persecuted because he was born Christian? He said, that's what I went by. That you shouldn't do to others what you don't want others should do to you. And that was his answer. We never spoke about it at any other time.
Was he ever recognized for the help that he gave to the Jewish children?
No, when he... Actually, there was one other young man who was hidden in that same town than I. Actually, he was also in the school, in the high school for boys. And when it came holiday time, his mother, who was a widow, as I know, his sister and brother-in-law were in Nice, you know, the Côte d'Azur. And Nice at the time was even freer than the unoccupied France because the Italians occupied a part of the Côte d'Azur. And there the Jews were free. Up to 1944, actually. So when came the holiday of 1943, the holidays in 1943, he went to his mother. And he did not come back for the school year. He stayed because they were free. And there also, one night, they were rounded up. And he ended up in Auschwitz. And I know that Cazalet used to say, he could have saved himself a year of hardship because he was arrested in 1944, which was about the time we were almost liberated. And he was sent, he still had like 1 year of camp because they were only liberated in 45. He tried to do something about it. I didn't know how to go about it as a I'm sorry thing. And when we started asking about and see, you needed a lot of testimony. My husband wanted to do it for somebody else that had been helping them during the war. He should have saved at least, I don't know how many people. And we didn't have the names of those people. Even Cazalet himself, once they were gone, he didn't know who it was or what it was, whether it was a real name or not a real name or so on. So that we never did anything about it. What we did was only what we could do personally, and to tell you the truth, that from all the children that had been there and had been placed, whether they knew it was Cazalet or not, I don't know. There was only Arnold and I that really kept in touch and knew what he did. I don't think that maybe it would have touched him or what, but he also went very soon after they started doing the recognition for people.
Why did you decide to do your testimony?
Excuse me?
Why did you decide to do this testimony?
Well, I tell you the truth. I didn't think that my story was so important. I really didn't go through so many sufferings or what. I thought that I was one of the lucky ones. I really don't have any terrible stories or so on. Little things that I survived and can happen even in normal life, that you have a little incident that you don't know when it straightened itself out without any handicaps or so on. But then I heard that you also took a testimony from people that had even left Europe before the Holocaust to see how life was then and how they think. So I thought, well, I did survive the Holocaust in France. I did survive the Holocaust in Belgium. I did survive it. Maybe it was, and I know there aren't so many people from Belgium here. And even the people to give the testimony now, what my husband used to say is there aren't many left. And that's what I thought maybe it was worth doing it. My children know all. They know more than I thought they should know. They know everything. They know from my husband's life. They know his ways. That was the reason. I thought that if people that had not been through the Holocaust give testimony to find, like you said, to find out what was the life before, then maybe it was worth doing it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Can you date and identify the people in this photograph?
Yes, that's my husband's family. The picture was taken in Antwerp, I think in 1932. And there were 7 children, 2 survived. My husband and his brother, Jack, whom...
Could you identify the people in the photograph?
Yes, if I start from the right, it's the oldest brother, Alex, then the sister, the youngest, Esther, Jack, Maurice, Jos, Rosa, and my husband, Sammy, and the parents.
And the parents' names are?
She was Witte, my daughter's named after her, and he was Abraham.
And this was the family Schonberg?
Yes, that's my husband's family.
And they all perished except for your husband and
Except Jacques and Sammy, two of them.
Thank you. Okay. Please identify and date the photograph.
These are my parents when, in 1924 in Vienna, when they got engaged.
And their names?
Their name is Sabina and Joseph Roth.
Thank you. Please identify and date the photograph.
This is my mother in Vienna as a young girl. I don't know what age she was.
Married?
No, she was still single.
Her name then?
Sabina Reiner.
And the photograph was taken in Vienna?
The photograph is taken in Vienna. I don't know the years. I know she was still single. I really don't. I don't think there was a year on the photograph.
Thank you. Can you date and identify?
I think my mother told me he was going to be 4 years old or something like that, and she made the picture, told him to keep it secret because it was a surprise for my dad.
And that's your brother and his name?
That's my brother. His name is Otto. He was born in Vienna. Although my parents already lived in Belgium, my mother went back to be with her parents and her family when she had the baby.
So it's Otto Schonberg and the photograph is taken?
No, Otto Roth.
Otto Roth, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and the photograph is taken in Antwerp. Must have been 1928 or something like that.
Thank you. Please date and identify the photograph.
That was in 1942. I don't know exactly the date, but I don't know if all foreigners had to have profile pictures or if it became a law during the war. But we had to register as Jews, and we had to have up-to-date pictures profiled. Although I didn't have an identification card because it comes only at 15, I still had to have my picture taken. And when I remember distinctively that when my mother and I went to pick up the pictures, the photographer looked at them and said, "Look, with profiles like this, I really don't see why you register as Jews." And he must have known something we didn't.
So that's you, Rose Roth?
Yes, Rose, then 1942.
In Rodez?
In Rodez.
Thank you. Please identify and date the photograph.
That must have been 1943 or something like it. This is Marcel Cazalet.
The man who...
The man where I stayed. I called him my uncle. And
where would the photograph have been taken?
It was taken in Villefranche-de-Rouergue. It's the town where we lived at the time.
Thank you. Please identify and date the photograph.
Well, these are my mother's parents, Frieda Reiner and Menachem Mendel Reiner. And I don't know exactly the year of the photograph, but I know that after the war we had no pictures of them. So I went to the police department and I asked them whether I could have a picture of them from their identification cards from the files. And they gave it to me for 24 hours. So that I could go to the photographer, have a picture taken from the identification card pictures. And that was what we made copies for all the children.
And your grandparents perished?
My grandparents were deported in 1942.
Thank you. Can you date and identify the photograph?
That was when I graduated from Kindy, so it must have been 6 years, so 1935. That was at the end of the school year for speech day. We always had a play, and this is one of the rare pictures I have from my youth.
Can you date and identify the photograph?
This was taken for our 25th wedding anniversary, so that must have been 1985. And the children wanted a souvenir and a family picture. That's all they wanted for the wedding anniversary from us.
Can you identify your family, please?
Well, my husband and I, and from my oldest son Alain from left, in the middle my son Guy, who now goes by his Hebrew name Menachem. He lives in Israel, and my daughter Valerie, who also lives in Israel.
And your name is Rose Schonberg, and your
Rose
husband's name?
Schonberg and Sami Schonberg.
And the photograph was taken in Sydney?
In Sydney, yes.
Thank you. Can you date and identify the photograph?
Yes, this was taken in November 1995 when I visited my children in Israel, and at the time those are my 3 grandchildren.
Can you name them, please?
Yes, on this side is Shabtai, named after my husband, who is my daughter's son.
Is that on the right?
On the right, on the left. Then I have Michal, who is for my son, the little girl. And then I have Daniel Yosef, who is the son of my son, my second son.
And you are Rose Schonberg.
I'm Rose Schonberg.
So from the right, that is?
That's Shabtai.
Shabtai Schonberg.
Schonberg. No, Pessin. He's for my daughter. Shabtai Pessin, Michal Schonberg, and Daniel Schonberg.
Thank you. And the photograph was taken in Israel in?
November 1995.